June 21, 1945. The Atlantic was quiet, but the ship that carried its human cargo was anything but. Dozens of women in gray, shapeless uniforms stood along the railings, their eyes adjusting to the vastness of water and the strangeness of a voyage that promised uncertainty at every horizon. They were prisoners, auxiliaries of the German war machine, clerks, typists, nurses, and in some cases women who had served as camp staff. Some had joined out of ideology, others out of circumstance, but all were now bound together by defeat, exile, and the weight of an unfamiliar future. For most, the destination was unthinkable: America. The women expected a mirror of their own ruined homeland, razor wire, stone barracks, punishment. They whispered among themselves, rehearsing the humiliation they believed awaited them. Would they be paraded through American streets? Would soldiers mock their accents? Some carried scraps of fear sharper than hunger, rumors of Allied vengeance, rumors of hard labor fields, rumors that stretched into nightmares. They imagined America as a harsher Germany, one untouched by bombs but still ruled by iron. But the first glimpses already betrayed their expectations. As the vessel approached the coast, the prisoners noticed movement along the harbor. Dockworkers in dungarees shouted, laughing as they hauled crates of fruit and barrels of supplies. Young sailors leaned against railings, chewing gum, their grins easy, careless. Nothing here seemed crushed by war. No buildings lay flattened, no faces carried the gaunt lines of malnutrition. The German women stood transfixed, their own hollow cheeks and patched sleeves suddenly out of place in this scene of vitality. One of them, no older than 22, leaned into another and muttered, "It looks like a dream. Or a lie." Her companion shrugged, her face pale beneath her headscarf. They did not yet understand that for America, the war had been fought oceans away. When the ship docked and the women were led ashore, they clutched their bundles, spare stockings, a photograph, perhaps a comb, and followed the line of soldiers herding them toward waiting trucks. Then it happened, a flash of fabric in the corner of their eyes. At first they dismissed it as imagination, but then the reality sharpened. On the pier, strolling as if the war had never existed, was an American woman in a calf-length skirt of bright patterned cloth. She carried a handbag, her heels clicking against the wooden planks, and the sunlight caught the pleats of her skirt like rippling water. The POWs froze. Their boots clattered to a halt until a guard barked for them to keep moving. But the image lingered. No uniform, no gray, no ration patching, just color and freedom. To them, the skirt was impossible. In Germany, fabric had been rationed since 1939. Dresses were cut short, patched with flour sacks, reduced to utility. Bright patterns had vanished with the first bombs over Berlin. For these women, skirts belonged to memory, not reality. They whispered in disbelief as the trucks rolled through the town street. Shop windows revealed mannequins draped in skirts, blouses, even stockings. Another woman crossed the street carrying groceries in a basket, her skirt swaying as though war were only a rumor. The POWs craned their necks, eyes wide, silence broken by quick breaths and the occasional gasp. They were witnessing a civilization untouched by rubble, its women still adorned with color while theirs had been stripped to the bones of survival. One prisoner pressed her face to the glass, her voice trembling. "Do they not know there is war?" Another answered, "Perhaps they won it." The remark carried a bitterness that none could deny. The trucks rattled past billboards advertising soap and chewing gum, luxuries so trivial in America yet so unimaginable in Germany. Soldiers at intersections waved casually, some tipping their hats to passing women. The prisoners' hearts beat with confusion. Were these the victors they had been taught to fear? These Americans looked neither vengeful nor impoverished. They looked alive. Even within the trucks, the smell of food wafted in from bakeries along the street. Fresh bread, sweet, white, soft. In Germany, bread was dark, often stretched with sawdust or potato flour. Hunger had dulled their senses for years, and now the aroma made some of them dizzy. And always, always, their eyes returned to the skirts, symbols of a normalcy more shocking than any soldier's rifle. The guards did not comment. Perhaps they had seen the same reaction in other groups of prisoners. Perhaps they knew that America's greatest weapon was not its tanks or planes, but its ability to carry on life as if war were a distant storm. Night fell as the convoy reached the camp, but the memory of those skirts followed the women through the gates. They were assigned bunks in long barracks, their belongings inventoried, their uniforms exchanged for issued work clothes. Yet the talk that night was not of labor or punishment. It was of fabric, of color, of freedom glimpsed in the sway of a stranger's skirt. One woman, older than most, whispered into the darkness, "If our daughters could see that, they would know the world is not only ash." The others lay silent, turning the image over in their minds like a forbidden photograph. For the first time since capture, some felt not only fear, but curiosity. It would be wrong to imagine these prisoners as innocent. Many had served in the apparatus of occupation and oppression. Yet war reduces even the complicit to hunger, and hunger sharpens the eye to strange details. For them, skirts in America were not just clothing. They were proof of a civilization that had endured without losing its rhythm, proof that femininity and individuality had survived where theirs had been starved out. The irony was sharp. In Germany, propaganda had glorified sacrifice, insisting that every woman must give up comfort, color, softness, to feed the Reich's ambition. Now those same women, stripped of their cause and their nation's pride, were confronted with another truth, that across the ocean women had worked, fought, and yet still walked freely in skirts. For some, it was envy. For others, it was humiliation. But for all, it was unforgettable. The skirt had become a banner of survival, stitched in cotton and color, a quiet declaration that not every land had surrendered its soul to the fire of war. And yet, this was only the beginning. They had seen fabric, yes, but what came next would reveal that America's abundance was not confined to clothing. It would appear in food, in freedom, in the laughter of women who had never known ration books, and in the realization that the war they had helped to fight had been fought in another world entirely. The convoy that carried the women deeper into America rolled past fields that seemed endless, green and golden under the late summer sun. From the open windows of the transport trucks, the German prisoners watched rows of corn sway in the breeze, barns painted red and white like children's picture books, and houses with porches draped in flags. To women who had left behind craters where cities once stood, these scenes looked painted, as though they were being driven through a living postcard. The war they knew, ash, hunger, rubble, had not reached here. The central shock was not the men in uniforms or the guarded gates at the end of the road. It was what they saw in the towns along the way. On the sidewalks of small American streets, women strolled as if the war were only a distant rumor. They carried shopping bags filled with groceries, wore hair tied back with ribbons, and most astonishing of all, skirts in colors that seemed almost defiant. Red, navy, plaid, cotton that caught the light. For women who had worn the same gray issue for years, who had turned flour sacks into dresses and patched stockings until they became threadbare ropes, this abundance was incomprehensible. One prisoner, her face still sharp with suspicion, muttered, "Do they parade them for us on purpose?" But there was no parade. Life was simply carrying on, and it was carrying on in skirts. In Germany, fabric had vanished into uniforms and war production. Civilian dresses were shortened, pockets removed, hems rationed down to inches. Hitler's government had urged women to set aside vanity, to sacrifice color for the gray necessity of the Reich. Even cosmetics had been stripped away by shortage. In those years, femininity had become dangerous, even decadent, in the face of national struggle. Yet here, across the ocean, femininity was not just intact, it was walking freely down Main Street with a smile. The prisoners began to notice smaller details. A teenage girl balancing on a bicycle, her skirt flaring as she pedaled. A mother ushering her children into a bakery, her blouse neatly pressed, her skirt patterned with cheerful stripe. Schoolgirls skipping rope, their laughter bright, their clothing unscarred by mending. These visions stung more than barbed wire. They revealed not only America's prosperity, but Germany's poverty. The women carried those images with them into the camp. At night in their barracks, whispers replaced sleep. "Did you see the skirts? They were new. The girl had shoes, 2 pairs perhaps. Even the shop mannequins were dressed better than us." For some, the envy was biting. For others it carried a strange hope, that the world had not been entirely reduced to rubble, that somewhere life had endured untouched. It was not only clothing. The food in the camp, though modest by American standards, astonished the prisoners. Trays with white bread, coffee, beans, sometimes even meat. They had forgotten the taste of butter. In Germany, bread was stretched with substitutes: ground peas, barley husks, potato flour. Here, it was soft, almost sweet, a luxury that made some weep silently over their portions. One woman confessed in a letter, carefully censored, that her greatest shock was a breakfast that looked like Christmas. Statistics confirmed what their senses already told them. By 1944, the average American consumed more than 3,000 calories per day, while the German average had fallen below half that number. Rationing existed in the United States, yes, but it never approached the desperation of Europe. Sugar, gasoline, tires, coffee, these were managed, but fabric still existed for skirts, and bakeries still filled windows with pastries. To the POWs, America's plenty was not measured in numbers but in the sight of a teenage girl spinning in a skirt without worry of fabric police or ration inspectors. There was humor too, nervous at first, then sharp. One evening a young prisoner joked, "If they had invaded us in skirts like that, we would have surrendered faster." The laughter that followed was thin, edged with resentment, but laughter nonetheless. Even in captivity, they recognized the absurdity. They had braced for shackles, and instead they were undone by cloth. For others, the experience carried heavier weight. They thought of their sisters, their daughters, still in ruined Germany, patching garments until they disintegrated. Letters from home spoke of hunger so severe that even weeds were boiled into soup. How could America's streets be filled with dresses while their families starved? The question was not just envy, it was guilt, bitterness, and the first recognition of how deeply the Reich had failed them. Yet beneath the bitterness, something else stirred. The sight of women in skirts was not simply about clothing. It was about freedom of expression, individuality, and the preservation of identity in the midst of war. In Germany, uniformity had been demanded. In America, diversity appeared normal. Women here could work in factories, raise children, and still wear skirts that expressed something personal. That realization unsettled and fascinated the prisoners. One woman, older than the rest, spoke softly one night. "I thought war had stolen everything from us. But perhaps it only stole from Germany." Her words lingered, unchallenged, because they carried a truth too raw to deny. The camp itself became a strange theater of contrast. Guards were firm but not cruel. Rules existed, but they were not enforced with the brutality the women had expected. Some guards even treated them with a kind of professional courtesy. It was disorienting. They had braced for revenge, yet what they received was structure, food, and glimpses of a civilian world that seemed untouched. Still, the skirts remained the most haunting detail. They came to symbolize more than prosperity. They were banners of survival, proof that life could resist the gravity of war. Each time the prisoners were transported for work details, each time they glimpsed an American woman walking in town, the image returned. Skirts swaying in the breeze, bright against the gray of memory. The women did not know how to interpret what they saw. Was it arrogance, America flaunting its wealth in the faces of the defeated? Was it carelessness, a blindness to the suffering across the ocean? Or was it something else? Resilience, a determination to preserve beauty even when the world had demanded sacrifice? Whatever the answer, the effect was undeniable. The German women, once uniformed servants of a regime that had demanded conformity, now found themselves haunted by color, haunted by freedom stitched into cotton. What had begun as shock was becoming something larger, a realization that the ideology they had served might have stolen more than lives. It had stolen the very idea that women could remain themselves even in hardship. The conflict was no longer only about captivity. It was about perception, about identity, about the unsettling truth that across the Atlantic, life had survived differently. And with each passing day, the question grew sharper. If America's women could endure war and still walk proudly in skirts, what else might this country reveal? The answer was waiting, and it would arrive not in fabric but in flavors, in freedoms, in the unexpected laughter of children. The German women thought they had already been shocked enough, but what came next would test them in ways they never imagined. The first morning in the camp began with the clatter of metal trays. The women filed through the mess hall, their boots echoing on the wooden floor, expecting thin soup and crusts of bread, the kind of rations they had known for years. Instead, steam rose from vats of beans, slices of meat glistened under weak electric light, and pitchers of coffee lined the tables. At the end of the line, orderlies stacked loaves of bread so white and soft they looked like carved blocks of ivory. The German women stared, stunned. Some even hesitated to take their portion, as if the food were a trick. When they finally sat, the taste overwhelmed them. The bread was spongy, yielding under their teeth. In Germany, bread had been dark, dense, stretched with sawdust or potato flour until it scraped the mouth like grit. Butter had vanished from their lives years before, replaced by substitutes with no flavor. But here, even a thin pat of butter melted into the white slice, turning the mundane into luxury. One prisoner closed her eyes as she chewed, her lips trembling. Another whispered, "This is impossible. We are captives, and yet this is a feast." The coffee, bitter and rich, delivered its own shock. In Germany, chicory or roasted acorns had long stood in place of beans. Real coffee had become a memory. Now the women cradled tin cups, breathing in steam that seemed to promise both comfort and cruelty. How could their children back home be drinking boiled weeds while their captors drank the real thing? The guilt was as sharp as the flavor was sweet. Meals became lessons in dissonance. Every tray carried proof that America's war had been fought at a distance. By 1944, the average American diet still reached over 3,000 calories a day, while German civilians survived on less than half that amount. The numbers, recorded in Allied reports, matched the lived reality of the prisoners. They ate until their stomachs ached, then lay on their bunks in silence, torn between gratitude, resentment, and shame. Yet food was only part of the revelation. On work details outside the camp, the women discovered America's other treasures. In shop windows they saw displays of nylons, stockings gleaming like captured sunlight. In Germany, stockings had been patched with careful stitching, mended until only threads held them together. Many women had painted lines down the backs of their legs with pencil, pretending seams still existed. To see shelves stacked with nylons, untouched and plentiful, was like looking into another world. One prisoner pressed her face to the glass and muttered, "For this alone, they won the war." The stockings became a symbol of something larger, abundance and vanity unbroken by war. Even the smallest luxuries, denied to them for years, still flourished here. Chewing gum, lipstick, magazines filled with advertisements for perfume, all mocked the scarcity that had ruled their lives. Some women reacted with bitterness, spitting that Americans were wasteful. Others watched with quiet longing, wondering what it would feel like to walk in a new skirt, silk stockings brushing against calves, lipstick on lip. There were moments of awkward humor too. A guard caught a group of prisoners staring at a billboard that featured a woman in a skirt tossing her hair with carefree abandon. "She's selling soap," the guard remarked dryly. One German prisoner answered, "She is selling paradise." The guard chuckled, but the women did not. For them, the billboard was a reminder that even advertisements in America promised more comfort than daily life in Germany had delivered. Not all impressions were light. With each taste of bread, each glimpse of nylon, the women felt sharper pangs of memory. Families still in ruins, children queuing for scraps, husbands dead or missing in Soviet camps. Abundance here only magnified the emptiness there. The conflict deepened. To survive, they ate what was given. But to eat meant acknowledging that their nation had demanded sacrifice while delivering nothing but hunger. Letters home, censored before delivery, still carried fragments of awe. One woman wrote, "We eat white bread. I had forgotten it could exist." Another scribbled, "Their women wear color. Ours wear rags." Though the censors blacked out details, enough remained for families to sense the truth. America was not the mirror image of their misery. It was something else entirely. The prisoners spoke of it in hushed tones at night, trying to reconcile the contradictions. How could the Allies, the enemy they had been taught to fear, feed them better than their own leaders had? How could the women of America laugh freely in skirts while German women boiled weeds for soup? Some clung to anger, muttering that America's plenty was stolen from occupied land. Others began to question whether the Reich had not stolen more, from them, from their children, from their very dignity. The emotional impact was subtle but undeniable. Each meal chipped away at old certainties. Each shop window pressed new questions against their silence. The conflict was no longer external, not merely about defeat and captivity. It was internal, a confrontation between propaganda and lived reality. The bread in their mouths, the coffee in their cups, the stockings in the shop window, each proved that much of what they had believed was false. Even among themselves, the women argued. "They flaunt it to humiliate us," one insisted. Another shook her head. "No, they live this way. They have always lived this way." Silence usually followed. For the truth was harder to face than either accusation, that while Germany had demanded everything from its women, America had allowed its women to remain themselves. The guards did not speak of ideology. They simply carried out routines, opening gates, delivering supplies, escorting work details. But their casualness, their lack of hatred, made the shock deeper. Prisoners had expected cruelty, yet they were confronted with a different kind of weapon: normalcy. Bread, nylon, and laughter became sharper than chains. Some nights, when the lights went out, the women dreamed of home. In their dreams they gave their children white bread, placed stockings in their sisters' hands, painted their mothers' lips red. But morning always returned, and with it the gnawing truth that those dreams were reality only on this side of the ocean. By now, the skirts they had first noticed on the docks had grown into something larger. They were not just fabric. They were symbols of a civilization that had survived intact, symbols of identity unbroken by war. Every bite of bread, every glimpse of nylon, stitched those symbols tighter into their minds. The war was over, but the comparisons were only beginning. And still, one question lingered, heavy as the scent of butter and coffee in the air. If America could preserve color, taste, and femininity through years of war, what else had it preserved? The answer lay not in clothing or food, but in something deeper, something about freedom itself. And that, more than any slice of bread, was what would unsettle the women most. The weeks stretched into months, and what had begun as astonishment slowly hardened into reflection. The German women who had once stood rigid in gray uniforms now found themselves surrounded by reminders of a life they had never imagined. Each day of captivity was less about chains and more about contrast. The bread, the skirts, the nylons, all of these had become symbols, not only of America's plenty, but of something harder to define: freedom. They felt it most strongly when watching the women beyond the fences. On rare occasions, the prisoners were marched past towns on their way to work assignments, fields, warehouses, or maintenance tasks. Always there were skirts. Women walked quickly with baskets of groceries, their clothes swinging lightly around them. Young women laughed on bicycles, hair loose, dresses catching the wind. Even older women, faces lined with years, carried themselves with dignity in tailored skirts. For the prisoners, these sights cut deeper than any sermon about liberty. Here was a world where individuality had not been stripped away, where femininity was not rationed into gray cloth and slogans. In Germany, uniforms had ruled every corner of life. Brown shirts, black coats, gray dresses, armbands, each garment declared allegiance. To step outside that pattern was to risk suspicion. The women had grown accustomed to blending into a sea of sameness, told that unity demanded sacrifice, that vanity was betrayal. Now, in America, they saw that unity could coexist with color, that even in wartime a nation could preserve choice, laughter, small freedoms stitched into cloth. One prisoner, whose father had been a tailor in Leipzig, lingered at a shop window during a work detail. The display showed mannequins in skirts of blue, blouses with lace, jackets cut neatly at the waist. She whispered, half to herself, "He would have loved this fabric. He would have said it was alive." Her words trembled with something more than envy. They carried grief for what had been taken, not just lives, but the possibility of joy in small things. At night, in the barracks, debates unfolded. Some women clung to resentment. "It is arrogance," one insisted. "They flaunt it to make us feel small." Another answered quietly, "Perhaps they do not flaunt it. Perhaps they simply live." That answer silenced the room, because it suggested the hardest truth, that the war had demanded sacrifice not only of soldiers, but of beauty itself, and that America had refused to surrender it. The camp guards became part of this strange lesson. They were disciplined, but not cruel. They enforced rules, but without hatred. Their indifference, their casualness, unnerved the prisoners more than open hostility would have. It implied that America did not see them as threats, but as people to be managed, perhaps even pitied. This quiet treatment dismantled expectations. The women had been told that defeat would strip them of dignity, that captivity would crush them. Instead, they were confronted with a paradox. Their captors allowed them to feel more human than their own leaders ever had. The symbols piled up, bread, coffee, skirts, nylons, until they became unbearable to ignore. Together they formed a portrait of a society that had survived war without surrendering its soul. For the German women, that realization was both liberation and torment. It freed them from illusions, yet forced them to confront what had been stolen. Letters home revealed glimpses of this awakening. Censors blotted out details, but fragments slipped through. The women here are not gray. They walk as if the war never touched them. Children laugh loudly. Families who received these letters, reading between the lines, must have understood the deeper message. Their daughters, even in captivity, had seen something that Germany itself could no longer offer. The ideological weight of this discovery pressed heavily. Nazi propaganda had exalted sacrifice, uniformity, obedience. Women had been told they were the backbone of the Reich precisely because they endured deprivation. Yet across the ocean, women endured in another way, through the preservation of individuality, through clothes that expressed choice, through laughter that defied scarcity. The German prisoners could not reconcile these truths without feeling betrayed. Some resisted. "It is weakness," one argued. "They waste their strength on clothes." But others shook their heads. They had seen the factories, the warehouses, the endless fields of corn. They had seen that America had not collapsed under the weight of color. Instead, it had thrived. The transformation was not dramatic, not sudden. It was quiet, unfolding in whispers, in sidelong glances, in the way prisoners watched American women pass, and then looked at one another in silence. It unfolded in how they handled their issued clothing, how they stitched small details into seams, as if trying to reclaim some fragment of identity long suppressed. A ribbon tucked into hair, a seam adjusted, a button polished. It was nothing, yet it was everything. One evening, as the sun dipped low and cast long shadows over the camp, a guard passed by whistling a tune from a radio hit. The women sitting by the fence lifted their heads. The melody was light, playful, utterly ordinary. It had no place in war. And yet it existed here, drifting across the yard, as natural as birdsong. One prisoner whispered, They never let go of life. The others nodded, wordless, because the truth was too heavy to argue. The central conflict had shifted. It was no longer about the shock of captivity or the fear of punishment. It was about the haunting recognition that their captors had preserved something their own nation had destroyed. They had lived under a system that demanded everything and gave back only rubble. Now they saw that another way had been possible, and that recognition was more devastating than defeat itself. When release finally came, months or years later, many carried that memory with them back to Germany. They returned to ruins, to shortages, to families scraping survival from ashes. But they carried also the image of skirts, of bread, of laughter. They carried the unsettling knowledge that the war had not been equal, that their suffering had not been inevitable. For some, that knowledge turned into bitterness. For others, it planted seeds of change, small but enduring. In the end, the sight of skirts on American streets had not been a trivial detail. It had been a revelation. It showed that freedom could survive war, that femininity could outlast ideology, that individuality could remain intact even when bombs fell. For women who had lived in uniforms of obedience, this truth was more shocking than the might of armies. And yet, there was still a final question, unspoken but insistent, lingering in the minds of the prisoners as they stared through barbed wire at a world alive with color. If freedom could be worn on the body, could it also be carried in the heart? The answer was waiting in the silence of their return, and it would shape not only how they remembered captivity, but how they imagined the future.